Did you know a powerful emperor in the late 700s and early 800s saved European knowledge? Did you ever stop to think how chaos turned into classrooms across an entire empire? Get ready to explore the surprising journey of how one man changed learning forever. Number 8. Fixing the language mess and making writing beautiful. Picture this, it's the 700s, and across what we now call Europe, people are trying to read ancient texts, religious scriptures, and letters. But here's the kicker. The Latin everyone uses, the language of learning, the language of the church, is a total mess. It's like 1,000 different dialects where one person's Latin sounds completely different from another's. And the writing, oh boy, the writing, it's chaotic, messy, and super hard to read. Each region, sometimes even each monastery, had its own funky handwriting style. Letters would blur together, words were misspelled constantly, and trying to decipher a document from a few hundred miles away could give you a massive headache. Scholars of the time found themselves staring at pages, squinting, trying to figure out if that squiggle was an A or an O, a T or an I. It was a wild west of scribbles and linguistic quirks. The beauty and clarity of classical Latin were lost, drowned out by regional variations and poor training. Documents were often misunderstood, legal contracts were ambiguous, and religious texts, the very foundation of faith, became open to multiple, often conflicting interpretations. Think about trying to build a complex society when the very words you use to communicate are constantly shifting. It made unified governance difficult, it made trade negotiations tricky, and it made the spread of ideas incredibly slow and error-prone. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a roadblock to intellectual progress and a stable empire. Then steps in Charlemagne. He saw this problem, this tangled web of language and script, not just as an annoyance but as a genuine threat to his empire's stability and spiritual well-being. He understood that a strong empire needed strong communication, and strong communication needed a clear, consistent language. He believed that the purity of faith depended on the purity of the scriptures, and how could you have pure scriptures if no one could read them correctly? So he launched what was, in effect, a massive language and handwriting reform project. He wanted everyone from the humblest monk in a remote abbey to the most learned scholar in his palace to be able to read and understand texts written in a common, standardized Latin. This wasn't about creating a new language. It was about restoring the old one, bringing back the grammatical rules and vocabulary of classical Latin, the kind Cicero and Virgil would have recognized. It was a huge undertaking, requiring countless hours of dedicated work from the best minds in his realm. He didn't just wish it to happen. He put specific people in charge of making it happen, providing them with the resources and the authority they needed. He made it clear that this was a top priority, not some academic sideline. The solution to the handwriting problem was something truly revolutionary: Carolingian Minuscule. Before this, scripts like Merovingian, Beneventan, and Visigothic were dense, cramped, and often lacked clear separation between words. Carolingian Minuscule was different. It was clear, legible, and beautiful. Letters were distinct, round, and had a uniform size. Words were properly separated, which was a massive improvement over the older styles that often ran words together, making reading a guessing game. Think of it like going from a chaotic, hard-to-read chicken scratch to a clear printed font on your computer screen. It was designed to be easy on the eyes and quick to transcribe accurately. This new script made copying texts much faster and reduced errors significantly. Scribes could now read a text from one part of the empire and copy it in their own monastery without struggling to decipher every single word. This consistency meant that knowledge could travel more freely and accurately across the vast Frankish lands. This wasn't just about pretty handwriting. It was about enabling the widespread production and dissemination of texts, which was foundational to all other educational reforms. It was the invention of a printing press before the printing press, making books accessible in a way they hadn't been for centuries. Push this forward. Charlemagne gathered the best grammarians and scribes from across his empire and beyond. People like Alcuin of York, a brilliant scholar from England, became central to this effort. Alcuin, invited to the palace school, took on the monumental task of refining the new script and standardizing the Latin language. He oversaw the production of corrected versions of important texts, especially the Bible, making sure that the wording was consistent and accurate across different copies. Scribes were trained in this new, clear script, and in the revised Latin grammar monasteries became centers of this reform. Instead of just copying texts in their local, often corrupted styles, monks were instructed to adopt Carolingian Minuscule and to follow the standardized Latin. Charlemagne's decrees, like the Admonitio Generalis from 789, explicitly called for the correction of texts and the proper education of scribes. He didn't just suggest it, he commanded. He knew that the only way to achieve this massive overhaul was through direct royal authority. He wanted every religious text, every legal document, and every work of scholarship to be written in this precise, unambiguous way. The impact of this was profound. It meant that a scholar in Aachen could read a text produced in Tours or in St. Gall with ease. It facilitated communication, learning, and the spread of ideas. It made the entire intellectual world of the Frankish Empire more connected and coherent. This standardization laid the groundwork for the intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance, creating a common language and a common script that would endure for centuries, even influencing the typefaces we use today. Number 7. Building the brain trust at the palace. Imagine a time when there were no universities, no public libraries, no widespread schooling for everyone. Education was scattered, often limited to monasteries, and mostly focused on religious training. Kings and nobles, if they were educated at all, often learned only the basics of reading and writing, sometimes not even that. Many rulers were illiterate, relying on scribes and clerks to handle the written word. In the early days of the Frankish Empire, even churchmen struggled with basic literacy. The intellectual centers of the old Roman Empire had mostly crumbled, and Europe was in what historians sometimes call a dark age for learning. There wasn't a central place where great minds could gather, debate, and create new knowledge. There was no real hub for intellectual activity, no common ground where scholars from different regions could meet and share their ideas. Learning was a lonely pursuit, often done in isolation within the walls of a single abbey. This lack of a central intellectual powerhouse meant that knowledge was easily lost, and there was no coordinated effort to revive or spread it. It also meant that the ruler Charlemagne himself, despite his incredible ambition, often found himself surrounded by advisors who lacked the deep knowledge needed to help him govern such a vast and complex empire effectively. He recognized this gap and decided to fill it, not just for his own benefit, but for the future of his entire realm. Charlemagne's big move was to create what historians call the palace school, sometimes known as the Schola Palatina. Now, don't picture a school with classrooms and desks like you know them today. This was more like a roving intellectual salon, a gathering of the smartest people Charlemagne could find, brought together at his royal court, which itself often moved between different palaces. It was a place where Charlemagne himself could learn, but more importantly, where he could foster learning, debate, and the creation of new knowledge for his empire. This was a direct personal project for Charlemagne. He was fascinated by learning and deeply regretted his own limited formal education. He wanted to change that for himself and for future generations. Palace school became the heart of his educational revolution. It was where the most brilliant minds of the age came together, from across Europe, to share their knowledge, to teach, and to advise the emperor. It was an intellectual powerhouse, a beacon of learning in a world that desperately needed it. The very act of gathering such diverse talents under one roof was unprecedented for its time. It was a bold statement that intellectual pursuits were just as important as military conquests or political maneuvering. The teaching methods at the palace school were pretty unique. It wasn't just about lectures. There were lively discussions, debates, and personal instruction. Charlemagne himself often participated, sometimes even taking part in the late-night intellectual conversations. He was known to enjoy riddles and philosophical discussions, showing a genuine hunger for knowledge. The scholars at the palace school taught a variety of subjects, but they also engaged in practical tasks like writing official documents, composing poems, praising the emperor, and correcting important religious texts. They served as Charlemagne's personal brain trust, offering advice on matters of faith, law, and administration. Imagine having the smartest people in the world on speed dial, ready to answer your questions and help you solve complex problems. That's what Charlemagne created. He also commissioned these scholars to write textbooks, treatises, and commentaries that would then be distributed to other emerging schools across the empire. So the palace school wasn't just a place for learning. It was a factory for producing educational materials and setting academic standards for the entire Frankish realm. It was a place where ideas were refined and then spread outwards like ripples in a pond. The people who flocked to the palace school were truly exceptional. Charlemagne actively sought out and invited the most renowned scholars of his time, luring them with promises of patronage, intellectual freedom, and the chance to shape an empire. There was Alcuin of York, mentioned earlier, who became Charlemagne's chief advisor on educational matters, a true superstar of his era. There was Paul the Deacon, a Lombard historian and grammarian, known for his vast knowledge of classical and early Christian literature. Peter of Pisa, an Italian grammarian, taught Charlemagne Latin. Einhard, who would later write Charlemagne's biography, was another key figure, learning much from the scholars gathered there. These were not just teachers, they were thinkers, writers, and administrators. They lived at court, ate with the emperor, and played a direct role in shaping the intellectual and administrative life of the empire. They were the intellectual elite, given a platform and resources to pursue their studies and to spread their wisdom. Palace school was a testament to Charlemagne's vision that education was not just for the monks and clergy, but for the very core of his imperial administration. It served as a model for other educational institutions and proved that a dedicated, centralized effort could indeed revive learning on a grand scale. It showcased Charlemagne's belief that a strong leader needed to be surrounded by strong minds, not just strong warriors. Number 6. Powering up the priests and monks. Before Charlemagne, the situation for many priests and monks in the Frankish Empire was frankly a bit bleak when it came to education. Many priests were barely literate. Some couldn't even read the Latin words of the Mass they were supposed to be performing. Think about it. A priest trying to lead a religious service but struggling to understand the very prayers and scriptures central to his duties. This wasn't just a minor issue. It was a serious problem for religious life and the spiritual well-being of the population. How could people understand Christian teachings if their spiritual leaders couldn't clearly explain them or even read the Bible accurately? Sermons were often improvised based on faulty understanding or simply non-existent. Quality of religious services varied wildly from one church to another, and many common people received little consistent religious instruction. Monasteries, which were supposed to be centers of learning and piety, often fell short. Some had excellent libraries and devoted scribes, but many others were intellectually impoverished, with monks who spent more time on manual labor than on scholarly pursuits. The intellectual light of the church which had once been so bright in parts of the Roman Empire, had dimmed considerably. This widespread ignorance among the clergy wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a spiritual crisis. Charlemagne recognized that for his empire to be truly Christian and stable, the church had to be strong, and a strong church needed educated leaders. Charlemagne took a very direct and forceful approach to fix this. He understood that the church was the backbone of his society, and if its leaders were uneducated, the whole structure would suffer. He believed that proper worship and moral living depended on a clear understanding of Christian doctrine, and that understanding could only come from educated clergy. He issued royal decrees, most famously the Admonitio Generalis, in 789, which explicitly commanded bishops and abbots to improve the education of their clergy. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an imperial order. He demanded that priests be able to read and understand the scriptures, to preach effectively, and to perform the liturgy correctly. He insisted that monks dedicate themselves not only to prayer but also to study, particularly the study of Latin, theology, and the rules of their monastic orders. He made it clear that ignorance among the clergy was unacceptable. He even specified that bishops should not ordain anyone who was uneducated, putting a stop to the practice of simply appointing people to religious positions without proper training. This was a radical shift, prioritizing intellectual ability and theological understanding for spiritual leadership. To make this happen, Charlemagne mandated the establishment of schools within every cathedral and monastery. These weren't just for monks and priests in training, but also for those already serving. Clergy were required to attend these schools, refresh their knowledge, and learn proper Latin grammar and rhetoric. Curriculum focused heavily on the Bible, patristic texts, writings of early church fathers, liturgical practices, and basic arithmetic for calculating the date of Easter. They also learned about music, specifically Gregorian chant, to ensure uniformity in church services. The goal was to create a standardized, educated clergy across the entire empire. Charlemagne saw that if the clergy were unified in their knowledge and practices, it would help unify his diverse empire. This emphasis on clerical education meant that a priest in a small village would eventually receive the same level of training as one in a major city. This greatly improved the quality of religious services and the theological understanding of the common people. It also meant that the church could better serve as a moral and intellectual guide for society. The impact was immediate and long-lasting. Bishops and abbots, under imperial pressure, began seeking out learned individuals to staff their new schools and to teach their existing clergy. They started sending promising young men to the palace school or to other leading monasteries for advanced training, creating a ripple effect of educational improvement. Monasteries that had previously neglected scholarship now became vibrant centers of learning, their scriptoria humming with the sound of quills scratching on parchment as monks copied and corrected texts. Clergy became better equipped to preach, to interpret scripture, and to provide spiritual guidance. This raised the overall intellectual level of the church in the Frankish Empire, transforming it from a collection of isolated, often struggling communities into a more cohesive and intellectually robust institution. This reform was crucial because the church was the primary institution for preserving knowledge and culture during the early Middle Ages. By revitalizing its intellectual core, Charlemagne ensured that the flame of learning, flickering precariously before his reign, would not only survive but also grow brighter, laying the foundation for future intellectual advancements in Europe. It showcased his understanding that a strong spiritual foundation was as vital as a strong military for a thriving empire. Number 5. Spreading the schools beyond the palace walls. Before Charlemagne, learning opportunities were severely limited. If you weren't training to be a monk in a well-endowed monastery, or perhaps lucky enough to live near a bishop who cared deeply about education, your chances of getting any kind of formal schooling were pretty slim. Most monasteries focused inward, preserving their own traditions and sometimes copying texts, but they weren't necessarily outreach centers for widespread education. Cathedrals, the seats of bishops, varied wildly in their educational efforts. Some might have a small school for a few clerical candidates, but many did not. There was no real system, no network of schools across the vast Frankish lands. Education was a privilege of the very few, mainly those destined for a monastic or clerical life, and even for them the quality was inconsistent. For the average person, or even for the sons of nobles not heading into the church, practical skills were taught at home or through apprenticeships, but academic learning was largely out of reach. This meant that literacy rates were low, even among the nobility, and intellectual life outside of a few isolated pockets was stagnant. Knowledge was fragmented, tucked away in individual libraries, not widely shared or cultivated. Charlemagne recognized that for his empire to truly flourish and for his reforms to take root, education couldn't be confined to a few elite institutions or just to his personal court. He needed to make learning more widespread, more accessible, and more uniform. Charlemagne's groundbreaking vision was to establish schools not just at his palace, but at every cathedral and monastery throughout his empire. This was a radical idea for the time. He issued specific instructions such as in the Admonitio Generalis of 789, urging bishops and abbots to set up schools where boys can learn to read. This was a direct mandate, not a gentle suggestion. He envisioned a network of educational centers that would serve as the backbone of his intellectual revival. These schools were to be accessible to anyone with potential, not just those from wealthy families or those already destined for a religious life. This was a significant step towards a more democratized access to knowledge, even if it was still heavily focused on the clergy and administration. By mandating schools at these established institutions, Charlemagne leveraged existing structures to implement his ambitious educational program. He understood that if learning was to spread across his vast empire, it needed local hubs where people could be trained. These weren't just theoretical aspirations. Imperial inspectors were sent out to ensure these mandates were being followed, and Charlemagne was known to personally inquire about the progress of these schools during his travels. Curriculum at these new cathedral and monastic schools followed the guidelines set by the palace school. It was centered around the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 main groups: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Grammar was about learning Latin correctly, rhetoric about effective speaking and writing, and dialectic about logical thinking and argumentation. These skills were essential for anyone who needed to read, write, or debate, especially priests, administrators, and legal scholars. Quadrivium offered a deeper understanding of the natural world and the cosmos, considered crucial for understanding God's creation. Beyond these liberal arts, the schools also focused on religious texts, especially the Bible, patristic writings, and liturgical chants. Students learned to read, write, and understand the standardized Latin that Charlemagne was promoting. They were trained to become literate clergy, effective administrators for the empire, and skilled scribes. These schools became places where classical knowledge, which had been in danger of disappearing, was studied, preserved, and transmitted to new generations. The impact of this widespread establishment of schools was immense. For the first time in centuries, there was a coordinated, empire-wide effort to educate a significant portion of the population. Monasteries like those at St. Gall, Fulda, Reichenau, and Tours became renowned centers of learning, attracting students from far and wide. They not only taught, but also became active centers of copying and producing new texts. Cathedral schools in cities like Reims, Orléans, and Corvey also flourished, training generations of literate clergy and royal officials. This created a new class of educated individuals who could fill important roles in the church and in the imperial administration. It wasn't just about religious instruction. It was about creating a skilled workforce for the empire. These schools provided the intellectual infrastructure that allowed Charlemagne's other reforms, like the standardization of texts and language, to truly take hold. They ensured that the intellectual revival wouldn't be confined to a single court, but would spread its roots throughout the empire. These schools became the foundation for the later medieval universities, proving that Charlemagne's vision of widespread education had a lasting legacy far beyond his own reign, shaping the very landscape of European intellectual life for centuries to come. Number 4. Saving the books. One copy at a time. Think about a world where every single book has to be copied by hand. No printing presses, no digital files, just a scribe with a quill, ink, and parchment, painstakingly reproducing every letter. Now imagine that for centuries, this process has been haphazard. Scribes often made errors, either because they were poorly trained or because the texts they were copying from were already filled with mistakes. Different regions had different versions of the same book, often with confusing variations. Many precious texts from ancient Greece and Rome, works of philosophy, history, science, and literature, were simply moldering away in neglected libraries, sometimes crumbling to dust, sometimes eaten by insects, or simply lost because no one bothered to copy them. The intellectual heritage of antiquity was on the brink of vanishing. Even religious texts, especially the Bible, existed in numerous corrupted versions, making consistent theological understanding almost impossible. This wasn't just about losing old stories. It was about losing the knowledge and wisdom that had shaped civilization. Tomorrow, all our digital files vanished, and all our physical books started dissolving. That's the scale of loss that was happening in the centuries leading up to Charlemagne. The very memory of human achievement was fading. Charlemagne understood that a civilized society, and particularly a Christian empire, needed its books. He saw the degraded state of texts, both classical and Christian, as a spiritual and intellectual emergency. He made it a top priority to collect, correct, and copy manuscripts on a massive scale. This wasn't just a casual interest. It was a centrally organized imperial policy. He sent out scholars and emissaries to scour the libraries of Europe seeking out ancient texts, even those that had been long forgotten or were in terrible condition. His goal was not just to preserve what existed, but to create definitive error, free versions of important works. He focused particularly on the Bible, ensuring that the Vulgate Latin translation, the standard version of the Bible, was meticulously corrected and standardized. He also prioritized liturgical books, making sure that church services across his empire used the same correct texts. This was a monumental undertaking, requiring vast resources, immense dedication, and countless hours of meticulous labor from his best scribes and scholars. He saw this as literally saving knowledge, rescuing it from oblivion and making it available for future generations. To achieve this grand goal, Charlemagne massively expanded the scriptoria, which were the writing rooms in monasteries. He didn't just tell monks to copy. He provided the resources and the motivation. Skilled scribes were trained in the new clear Carolingian Minuscule script, making the copying process more efficient and accurate. New monastic centers like Tours, Corvey, Fulda, and St. Gall became incredibly productive, scriptoria producing hundreds, even thousands of new manuscript copies. These scriptoria weren't just copying machines. They were also centers of scholarship, where texts were compared, errors were identified and corrected, and new works were sometimes composed. Imagine a modern publishing house, but instead of machines, it's entirely powered by human hands, precision, and dedication. These monks worked tirelessly, often under difficult conditions, producing beautiful, legible copies of everything from classical Roman literature by authors like Virgil and Cicero to the complete works of early church fathers like Augustine and Jerome. They copied legal codes, historical chronicles, scientific treatises, and grammatical works. It was an explosion of literary production, unprecedented in centuries. The impact of this furious copying activity was nothing short of miraculous. Thanks to Charlemagne's efforts, roughly 90% of the surviving classical Latin works we have today owe their existence to copies made during the Carolingian Renaissance. If Charlemagne hadn't initiated this massive copying project, many of these texts would have been lost forever, leaving huge gaps in our understanding of ancient history, philosophy, and literature. This wasn't just about preserving old ideas. It was about ensuring that future generations would have access to the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. The corrected and standardized texts that emerged from Carolingian scriptoria became the authoritative versions that were then copied and recopied throughout the Middle Ages. The beautiful Carolingian Minuscule script became the standard for clear handwriting, influencing later Gothic and Humanist scripts, and ultimately our modern printed fonts. This systematic preservation of texts was the bedrock upon which all subsequent European scholarship was built. It was a conscious decision by Charlemagne to act as a guardian of knowledge, ensuring that the legacy of the past would not be forgotten, but instead serve as a springboard for the future. He understood that books were not just paper and ink. They were the very vessels of civilization itself. Number 3. Setting the standard with the 7 liberal arts. Before Charlemagne, the curriculum for learning was often haphazard and inconsistent. There was no widespread agreement on what subjects constituted a proper education, even for those destined for the clergy, while some elements of classical learning persisted in isolated monasteries. The structured approach of the Roman Empire's educational system had largely collapsed. What was taught varied wildly from one region or monastery to another. Some places might focus heavily on basic literacy for reading the Bible, others might emphasize manual labor, and some might neglect intellectual pursuits almost entirely. There was no common core knowledge that all educated people were expected to share. This lack of a standardized curriculum meant that a person trained in one part of the empire might have a completely different set of skills and knowledge from someone trained elsewhere, making collaboration and intellectual progress difficult. It was like every school deciding its own set of essential subjects with no common ground. This intellectual fragmentation hindered the development of a coherent intellectual culture and made it challenging to produce administrators and clergy with a consistent level of training and understanding. Charlemagne realized that for his empire to function effectively and for his ambitious reforms to take root, there needed to be a universally recognized standard for what constituted a comprehensive education. Charlemagne looked to the past for inspiration, specifically to the Roman tradition of the 7 liberal arts. This wasn't a new invention. The concept had been around for centuries, categorizing the essential subjects for a free citizen's education. Charlemagne, advised by scholars like Alcuin, decided to revive and promote this structured curriculum throughout his empire's schools. He mandated that these 7 subjects form the core of instruction in all cathedral and monastic schools, as well as at his palace school. This was his way of setting a uniform standard for what qualified as an educated person in his realm. It provided a clear pathway for learning, ensuring that students, regardless of where they were educated within the Frankish Empire, would receive a consistent and comprehensive intellectual foundation. This move wasn't just about academic tradition. It was intensely practical. Charlemagne believed that mastering these arts would produce not only learned individuals but also highly competent and effective administrators, clergy, and advisors for his empire. He understood that a well-ordered society needed well-ordered minds. The 7 liberal arts were divided into 2 main categories, the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, meaning the 3 roads, focused on the linguistic arts. First came grammar, which was all about learning Latin correctly, understanding its rules, and interpreting texts. This was absolutely foundational, given Charlemagne's push for standardized Latin. Next was rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. This taught students how to express themselves clearly, logically, and effectively, a vital skill for preachers, lawyers, and administrators. Finally, there was dialectic, or logic, which trained students in critical thinking, argumentation, and how to analyze ideas systematically. Mastering the trivium was about developing clear thought and effective communication. It was the essential toolkit for anyone working with words and ideas. Then came the quadrivium, meaning the four roads, which focused on mathematical and scientific subjects. This included arithmetic for basic calculations, geometry for understanding space and forms, astronomy for studying the stars and celestial movements, which was important for timekeeping and religious festivals, and music not just for playing instruments, but for understanding the mathematical ratios and harmonies that underpinned it, often seen as a reflection of divine order. These subjects were seen as leading to a deeper understanding of the universe and God's creation. The impact of promoting the 7 liberal arts was profound. It gave structure and coherence to education across the empire. It ensured that students received a broad, foundational education that prepared them for advanced theological study, administrative roles, or further academic pursuits. It produced generations of literate, articulate, and logically thinking individuals who could serve the church and the state with greater competence. Scholars like Alcuin produced textbooks and commentaries on these subjects, making them accessible to teachers and students across the Frankish lands. For example, Alcuin wrote a dialogue on grammar, making the learning process more engaging. This standardized curriculum meant that a graduate from a monastic school in Fulda would have a similar foundational knowledge to one from a cathedral school in Tours, fostering a shared intellectual culture. It elevated the quality of instruction and raised expectations for what an educated person should know. This revival of the liberal arts tradition was key to the Carolingian Renaissance, creating a new intellectual bedrock that would shape European education for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the university system that would emerge later in the Middle Ages. It showed that Charlemagne was not just interested in military victories, but in intellectual prowess as a cornerstone of his empire. Number 2. Assembling a team of scholars. Before Charlemagne, the intellectual landscape of Europe was scattered. The best scholars were often isolated in distant monasteries or regional courts, with limited opportunities to interact, collaborate, or share their knowledge on a large scale. While some regions like Anglo-Saxon England or Lombard Italy had pockets of impressive learning, there was no central force bringing these intellectual giants together. Communication was difficult, travel was dangerous, and there was no systematic way for knowledge to cross borders effectively. This meant that intellectual progress was slow, and important insights or texts developed in one area might never reach another. The continent was in a state of intellectual fragmentation with no unified direction for scholarly endeavors. Imagine a bunch of brilliant scientists working on similar problems, but each in their own disconnected lab, unaware of each other's breakthroughs. This lack of collaboration and centralized patronage meant that much intellectual potential remained untapped, and the recovery of lost knowledge was a slow, piecemeal process. Charlemagne saw this as a weakness. He knew that to rebuild learning and to truly lead a Christian empire, he needed the best minds working together under his guidance to shape the future. Charlemagne actively sought out and attracted the most brilliant scholars from across Europe, bringing them to his court and scattering them to lead his new educational institutions. This was a deliberate and strategic policy, almost like a talent scout building an all-star team. He didn't wait for scholars to show up. He sent invitations, sometimes even demands, offering patronage, protection, and the opportunity to work on projects of imperial significance. He knew that to achieve his ambitious goals, standardizing language, reforming the church, preserving texts. He needed people with deep knowledge and exceptional teaching skills. He didn't care where they came from. He only cared about their ability and their willingness to contribute to his grand vision. This active recruitment was groundwork, transformed his court into a vibrant intellectual hub, a magnet for learning and debate. He created an environment where scholars felt valued and empowered to pursue their intellectual passions, knowing they had the emperor's full support. This network of recruited scholars became the driving force behind the Carolingian Renaissance. The team he assembled was truly impressive. The most famous example is Alcuin of York, a renowned scholar from Northumbria, part of modern-day England, who Charlemagne met in Parma in 781. Alcuin became Charlemagne's chief advisor on educational and ecclesiastical matters, playing a pivotal role in designing the curriculum, standardizing texts, and leading the palace school. He was the intellectual architect of many of Charlemagne's reforms. Then there was Paul the Deacon, a learned Lombard monk and historian from Italy, who was an expert in classical and early Christian literature. He contributed to the standardization of liturgical texts and wrote important historical works. Peter of Pisa, another Italian grammarian, tutored Charlemagne himself in Latin. From Ireland came scholars like Dungal and Clemens Scotus, bringing with them a strong tradition of Irish scholarship. Einhard, Charlemagne's future biographer, was also educated at the palace school and became a key administrator. These scholars brought with them diverse perspectives, texts, and pedagogical methods, enriching the intellectual life of the court and the empire. They weren't just teachers. They were authors, editors, advisors, and intellectual leaders who helped shape Charlemagne's policies. The impact of gathering these scholars was. They established the intellectual foundations of the Carolingian Renaissance. They worked on the standardization of Latin and Carolingian Minuscule, oversaw the massive copying projects, wrote textbooks for the newly established schools, and reformed the liturgy. They didn't just teach, they created new knowledge and corrected old texts. Their presence at court made the palace school a dynamic center of learning, attracting other aspiring intellectuals. When some of these scholars, like Alcuin, later retired from the court, Charlemagne often placed them in charge of important monasteries, which then became leading educational centers themselves, spreading the intellectual innovations developed at court further into the empire. For example, Alcuin became abbot of Saint Martin of Tours, turning it into one of the most productive scriptoria and influential schools of the era. This strategic deployment of scholars ensured that the reforms were not limited to the court, but disseminated throughout the empire. It fostered a vibrant exchange of ideas and created a pan-European intellectual community. Charlemagne's deliberate effort to attract and utilize these brilliant minds was fundamental to his educational revolution, proving that investing in human intellect was as crucial as investing in armies or buildings for the long-term strength of his empire. He truly understood that minds, not just might, built lasting power. Number 1. The emperor's direct orders and personal drive. Before Charlemagne, education was not a priority for most secular rulers. Kings were primarily focused on warfare, expanding their territories, and maintaining power through military might and political maneuvering. Learning was largely left to the church, and even within the church, it was often inconsistent and localized. There was no overarching royal policy or systematic effort to promote education across a vast empire. If a king was educated, it was usually because of personal interest or family tradition, not as part of a grand imperial strategy. The idea of a ruler actively commanding his subjects to learn or demanding schools be established was almost unheard of. This meant that the educational system, or lack thereof, was fragmented and relied heavily on individual initiatives rather than centralized direction. There was no real accountability, no imperial oversight to ensure quality or consistency. The Frankish Empire, despite its growing size and power, lacked the intellectual infrastructure that had characterized previous great empires. Charlemagne, however, had a fundamentally different vision. He believed that a strong Christian empire required educated leaders, literate clergy, and subjects who understood their faith and laws. He saw education not as a luxury, but as a vital tool for governance, spiritual health, and imperial unity. Charlemagne's personal involvement and direct decrees were the driving force behind his educational revolution. This wasn't a reform he delegated and forgot about. He was deeply and personally invested. He couldn't read and write perfectly himself until later in life, and he felt this keenly, which spurred his desire for others to be better educated. He understood that imperial power wasn't just about military strength, but also about intellectual and spiritual authority. He issued specific, detailed capitularies, royal legislative decrees that directly commanded improvements in education. The most famous of these is the Admonitio Generalis from 789. This comprehensive decree addressed many aspects of clerical life, but a significant portion was dedicated to education. Ordered bishops and abbots to establish schools, to correct liturgical books, to improve the literacy of their clergy, and to teach boys grammar, arithmetic, and music. Another important decree, De Litteris Collendas, on the cultivation of letters, sent out around 794, emphasized the importance of proper language and understanding in interpreting religious texts, arguing that without proper study, errors in understanding could lead to errors in faith. These weren't just suggestions, they were binding laws, backed by the full authority of the emperor. Charlemagne didn't just issue orders, he actively enforced them. He sent out imperial agents known as missi dominici to inspect monasteries, cathedrals, and local churches to ensure that his educational mandates were being followed. These inspectors checked on the quality of schools, the literacy of clergy, and the accuracy of copied texts. If they found deficiencies, they reported back to Charlemagne, and the responsible officials would face imperial displeasure. He also used his personal patronage to reward scholars and to support the institutions that excelled in learning. His court was a living example of his commitment, with scholars constantly present, engaging in debates and producing new works. He personally questioned clergy on their understanding of Scripture and their ability to read Latin. His genuine enthusiasm for learning was infectious and set an example for his entire court and eventually his empire. He understood that top-down leadership was essential to implement such a monumental change across a vast and diverse realm. His relentless pursuit of educational excellence permeated every level of his administration and the church. The impact of Charlemagne's direct and personal intervention was monumental, transformed education from a scattered, often neglected activity into a central pillar of imperial policy. His decrees provided the legal and political framework for the establishment of schools, the standardization of texts, and the improvement of clerical literacy. Without his direct command, constant pressure, and personal example, many of his ambitious reforms simply would not have happened. His efforts created an unprecedented uniformity in education across his empire, something that had not been seen since the height of the Roman Empire. The Carolingian Renaissance was not a spontaneous event. It was a deliberate, top-down initiative, spearheaded by one man with an unshakable belief in the power of knowledge. He demonstrated that a strong ruler could actively shape the intellectual and cultural landscape of his realm, not just its political boundaries. His personal drive effectively forced an entire empire to prioritize learning, sowing the seeds for intellectual growth that would flourish long after his reign and fundamentally change the course of European history. He proved that true leadership extended beyond the battlefield, reaching into the minds and hearts of his people through the power of education.